or 1,000. So we point this out, and that's a valid point to make to a Christian or a faithful Christian or Jew. But the problem is, in our times, there are few faithful Christians and Jews. And they are also being eliminated from the picture, and more people are turning agnostic. And they have no problem criticizing these biblical figures as well. And so with them, you really cannot quote the past at all, because they will say that's also wrong, what they did. Okay? And to that person, all that we can say, and this is the max, as much as we can say, is that that was a different world, and a different time, and a different place, and a different custom, and a different role. And people across the globe had different views about this notion. And while I was doing my research today, I actually came across a Jewish website, Q&A, like we have Islamic Q&A, they have another equivalent. And a questioner is asking the rabbi that, how can I understand that Solomon used hundreds of thousands of slaves to build the temple? Doesn't this go against, humanism and being nice and whatnot? Now, he's not asking about the slave girls. He's asking about slaves, because the Bible says that he used 100,000 slaves to build the grand temple. So this man is saying, I feel disgusted, and how can I be a Jew after this? How could our prophet have used, he's talking from himself's perspective, all of these slaves. So this rabbi, his name is Rabbi Perry Rank from New York, he responds, and this is basically the response we can give, that the thing about history is it does tend to be brutal, and it strips us about our most cherished illusions about the past. So whenever we delve into history, we have to approach it cautiously, knowing that we might not return the same way we entered it. It's going to change our perception. Solomon was a great builder, and as such, he needed workers whom he secured through the institution of basically slaves or forced labor. This was not an uncommon practice in ancient times. So how shall we read this? Shall we read it as slavery or as employment? He's calling slaves employment, because that's, then he goes on. Has Solomon enslaved the masses, or has he provided them jobs? We tend to think of slavery as an ultimate evil of sorts. Here's the point. But the fact is that this was an accepted form of labor for thousands of years. And our disillusionment with it is only recent, 300 years old, and only about 150 years, especially here in America. And then he goes on, the Torah has very extensive rules about how to treat slaves. The idea was to humanize and to civilize, and so he's basically defending the classical notion of slavery. This is a modern, Jewish rabbi in New York, because they have the same problem we do, and that is the tradition clearly mentions slaves being used by the now of course we don't have any equivalent of 100,000 slaves being used in mass labor. We have one Maria that was treated very nicely. She has her own house. She's not working in the fields. But in the end of the day, from modern standards, this is not something that most modern humans would find palatable, right? And so we do need to, as much as we can, explain. So he says, this is not a defense of slavery. And I have to agree with everything he says here. I, like you, am a child of the anti-slavery movement of modern times. Meaning, we're living in modern times where everybody has agreed we should be anti-slavery. But let's realize that once upon a time, that wasn't the notion in history. And to read what goes on in ancient times through our contemporary eyes, and then to judge it, is really not fair to our ancestors. This is what the rabbi is saying. You cannot look through the lens of 2014 as you look at 620 CE and then expect them to have everything like we did. The world was a very different place, and everybody accepted it. And this is really harsh to say, but even the slaves of the time accepted it. That was the way that they were. And again, this is not a defense of slavery, but it is what... Now, here's another thing that I have to say here, and that is that the way that the slavery has existed in America in the 1800s is perhaps the most brutal manifestation of this institution in the history of humanity. That, realistically speaking, the way that America used slaves, imported them, caught free people, and brought them here, and used them worse than cattle and animals, and mistreated them and considered them to be inhumane. Even the ancient Greeks were better to their slaves than this reality. So one of the byproducts of being so harsh towards slaves was the anti-abolitionist movement came out of that. right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But the point is that we need to understand, and this is not sugarcoating, this is a fact, that slavery did not exist in Islamic lands the way that it existed in America. That's for sure. This is not to sugarcoat. There was slaves. Of course there were slaves. But, and I have a number of quotes, but we don't have time to get into them, but it is very true, historically speaking, and there are quotes that I can bring to you, maybe we'll have another talk about this, historically speaking, that the first Europeans that visited Ottoman lands and visited Muslim lands and interacted with basically Muslims, they were amazed at how the slaves were treated in Muslim lands compared to how they're treated in European lands. So they're amazed at how gentle, how kind the slave, one of them marks, the slave speaks back to the master that, cut back my work or whatever. I mean, he'll actually argue with the master. And we know from our Islamic history that some slaves even became kings. The Mamluk dynasty, which was the most prestigious dynasty that fought against the Mongols, right? Genghis Khan's hordes, or the great-grandson of Genghis Khan. The Mamluk, what does Mamluk mean? It's called the slave dynasty. Literally, Mamluk means slave. And this dynasty was a dynasty of slaves who eventually rose to power and became the Khulafa. And they ruled over the Muslim world for almost 500 years, up until the advent of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1792. I mean, it's really bizarre. Napoleon fought the Mamluks. Napoleon's fighting with guns, the Mamluks are fighting with swords. That's one of the reasons why they lost, okay? And that was the beginning of modernity. Muhammad Ali Pasha of Egypt came, and then modernization began, because the Mamluks were destroyed. Point being, that who were the Mamluks? They were a slave dynasty, okay? So, in the end of the day, yes, we can add all of these points. There's only so much rationalization that I can do, only so much sugarcoating. If somebody wants to find fault with what happened, then honestly this is the perspective of 2014 being back projected onto 610. There's nothing I can do about that, okay? But I, as a Muslim who believes this man to be a prophet of Allah, I accept this was acceptable for the time and the place. And we also have to add here, this is compounded by the fact that in modern times we have these extremist groups that are now starting this whole notion of entrapping and basically conquering innocent women and then making them into slaves, right? We have the Boko Haram, we have the ISIS, we have all of this. So this obviously complicates it. And you then have people saying, oh look, they're basing this on the Prophet. And this is ludicrous, because what Boko Haram is doing is haram. Because, why is this? Because, well, many reasons. The most obvious one, the Sharia completely and uncategorically forbids taking a free person and making them into a slave. There is a channel to become a slave, and that is prisoners of war who are not ransomed off, okay? It is absolutely uncategorically haram, like what Boko Haram has done, is to invade a Christian village and take schoolgirls in broad daylight and then make them into slaves. Or what ISIS is doing with the Yazidi families. What wrong have they done? Where is the sin or the crime? Where is the jihad being waged? Who is the Khalifa? Where are the prisoners of war? This is complete haram. So we're not even, there's no comparison at all with what is happening in modern times, with what happened in the past. And also, of course, there's another point, and that is that scholars of our era have agreed that slavery is now a thing of the past. Just like in other faith traditions where, yes, there were times when slavery was practiced and they justified it, but now, in the era that we live in, I don't know of any scholar of our tradition, I don't know of a single alim that is calling for a return to slavery. Things have moved on. And I'll give you just one example of this that I know for a fact. My own dear teacher, Shaykh Muhammad bin Salih al-Uthaymin. Shaykh al-Uthaymin, a very famous alim. Of course, he passed away more than a decade and a half ago. But when the Bosnian War was taking place, and this is in the early 90s, he was very much involved with giving advice to the people. And that was a legitimate war, a legitimate jihad. Everybody acknowledges that the Serbs were massacring the Muslims. There was so much bloodshed. The UN, as you know, has done a tribunal and a crimes court against the Serb leaders, right? Everybody acknowledges that this was a legitimate jihad, that Muslims had to defend themselves. I know for a fact that Shaykh ibn Uthaymin was asked by some of the people on the ground, we have prisoners of war, we can't ransom them off, can we take them as milk yamin? And the Shaykh said, no, this is not allowed in our times. And this is a shaykh that is generally considered very ultra-conservative, very hardline, whatnot. Of course, that's the way they perceive him. I consider him to be a great alim. But the point being, this is a faqih. He understands you can't do this. This is not something we resurrect from the books of fiqh, right? So this is something that very clearly our scholars have understood that, no, you don't do this anymore. That's something that, okay, it was permissible for the time. Now, it's not something that we need to resurrect. And so, the point is that our Prophet ﷺ was indeed gifted Maria. Maria was not our mother. She's not of the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen. So we do not view her as being of the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen. She was Milk Yamin. She remained Milk Yamin. And she was never a Zawja. And if she had become a Zawja, she would be of the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen. And so our Prophet ﷺ was gifted Maria. And of course we know that Maria gave birth to the son of our Prophet ﷺ, and that is Ibrahim. And there's one story that is also mentioned about Maria. And again, I mean, I've already mentioned to you a big issue about the whole issue of Maria, but I would rather you hear these things from me again, rather than you hear about them from some other website or other person. Then, this causes doubts. And again, wallahi, I'll be honest with you, if we lived in a different time, a different place, not everything needs to be mentioned. It's not, you just, okay, some things are healthy, some things there's no need to, put the spotlight on them. But I feel very strongly from my own experiences, in the time and place we live in, it is better that we talk about this in a frank manner, because we don't want our youth. Wallahi, even last week I got a call, from one of our youngsters. He had told me he is not a Muslim anymore, but his parents wanted me to talk to him and whatnot. Yeah, he's a murtad, he said this, I don't believe anymore. And he's quoting a number of things from the seerah. From the seerah. And these are things that are mentioned in the books. It's not something that, it's not, no, where did he hear about it from? Not from me. Not from, where did he hear, where do you think? Well, in particular, yeah, exactly. So he heard it from Islamophobes. He heard it from people that have this agenda, and he's logged on to